right. Well, welcome everyone to our webinar tonight. We are thrilled to have you join us. We are talking about trans aging today and caring for our elders and all the intersectional issues that come to play when we think about support of our trans and non-binary older adult community members. My name is Anneliese Singh. I use she and they pronouns, and I am excited to be with this amazing group of humans tonight. I want to give special thanks to Becca Ingram Estevez, one of our coordinators of this project, and also to Tanya Petit and Kate Stewart, who are part of the TRANSnetwork. This is a collaborative group in TRANSnetwork between the states of Georgia, North Carolina, and Arkansas. And we have a lot of other partners that are in advisory boards in each of those states. I want to send thank yous to them as well. The purpose of tonight is really for us to give some education and guidance about supporting older adults who are trans and non-binary. And so as we enter this conversation tonight, I think you're going to be excited to hear just the experiences that this particular group brings to this conversation. But I also want us to think about what we can change in our practices. You know, I think it can be not fun for us to share our experiences and share knowledge and then have things not change. We are recording tonight's webinar, and so I think I'm excited that that will be available for providers, educators, community members to watch and share. I think this is one of the conversations we don't always have in trans and non-binary community, and probably one of the most important ones to have. It's about life, it's about living, it's about joy, it's about support, and it's about justice and liberation. And so I am going to also give you a little housekeeping. You will see at the bottom of your webinar link a Q&A. Feel free to put questions there. You can also put them in the chat box. I'll be able to find them there. I will run a few polls during our time together, so keep a lookout for those as well. So here come the intros. Get ready. First up, wow. Luminary, Lea Córdova, has her master's in physics and master's in physical oceanography. Born in Chile in 1941, Lea came to Duke Medical Center in 1974, where she taught physics and marine sciences departments at the University of North Carolina. She retired from Duke and UNC, and she was a biomedical scientist, an IT manager, and a medical Spanish interpreter for Duke Health. Since 2005, she served as a volunteer on the LGBT task force at Duke University and for the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at Duke Medical School. This is her third year as a member of the board of directors at Durham Center for Senior Life. And recently, she's been mostly watching foreign films made by and reading literature written by women. Love that. That's my partner loves to do that too, Lea. So I love reading that. During the last year, she stayed in place and watched a lot of mostly foreign TV shows, fixed her house, and tried to remain in shape by exercising 3 to 5 times a week. You are my sheriff. And next, another just incredible person in our community, Evelyn Olansky, is a trans person who received her Master's of Public Health and Epidemiology in 2013 and has been making trouble ever since. I love that line of your bio, and I will attest to witnessing the good trouble she's making. In her work, developing and implementing a federal trans-focused health survey and other programs, she's doing her best to queer historically cis-normative systems. If there's a room where trans people are being discussed without trans input, Evelyn will be there to problematize cis-normative thinking. Thank you. Push back against covert oppression and to hold up a megaphone for other trans and gender nonconforming voices to be heard. Thank you for that work. Jamie Roberts is a native of Georgia, born and raised in Griffin, a longtime friend, a current resident of the Eastlake neighborhood of Atlanta. And she's active in the trans and gender nonconforming community, as well as the greater LGBTQI community of Metro Atlanta as a volunteer for several organizations, including Trans Housing Atlanta Program, Inc., and the Southern Unity Movement. These are powerful grassroots organizing movements. So thank you, Jamie. With a background of 21 plus years in law, she recently earned her MFA in screenwriting and is pursuing a second career in film and digital media. And we just love that so much. We are ready to see all your creative work upcoming. And I've gotten to see some of her creative work in her work with the Georgia Safe Schools Coalition with queer and trans youth. So thank you, Jamie, for being here. Last but not least, Dr. Masil George is the co-chair for the LGBTQ subcommittee of the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences. She's a board certified family medicine practitioner, and she's also board certified in geriatrics and palliative care. She has a secondary appointment in Department of Bioethics and Medical Humanities. Her passion is to ensure vulnerable individuals receive respectful and knowledgeable treatment and patient-centered care, and that our learning campuses are welcoming and affirming places for everyone, including LGBTQ students and community members. So as you can see, we've got a smart as heck group of folks who are engage this topic. And the format tonight is we're going to open up with kind of a virtual roundtable, talking about a few really important questions. And then that will be amongst Evelyn, Jamie, and Lea. And then we'll have Masil, Dr. George tune in and kind of share us from a provider perspective, her thoughts. And then we'll have some responses to Masil's sharing, and then have some time to close out. So I am already seeing folks get some love in the chat box. So we see you, Dr. Petit. Thanks for being here. All right, roundtable. Here's your first question. How do you feel about aging as a trans and or non-binary person? And there may be other identities you want to share as well. So I don't know who wants to start on this one, but let's see who opens up first. Oh, actually, I think we said Lea goes first on this. So Lea, you're up.
Oh my God. This is, I had hoped to spoke last since I'm the older here. So, well, I'm really grateful that I've reached the age that I am, which is 80 years old in 2 days. And I consider myself very lucky to have reached this age in this country in the middle of pandemics and other awful things. And I just feel so incredibly grateful is not the full word. I am grateful to the universe for reaching this age and having acquired all the experience that I have since I came out in 1994. And I've been an activist since then. So that's all I can say. I'm eager to continue doing activism and include newer and newer generations of trans people, including kids, you know? That's it.
Well, I'm hearing, thank you, Lea. I'm hearing that long-time activism and just how you're taking care of yourself during the pandemic as well. So I appreciate you chiming in there. Jamie, Evelyn, how do you feel about aging as a trans and or non-binary person?
I'll jump in. Like Lea, I'm very grateful to reach the age of 49. And despite having some health issues that were congenital, has nothing to do with my gender status. You know, I feel like I've lived, you know, but for medical science, you know, I wouldn't have lived beyond my original shelf life, I think. So I'm grateful for that. And I'm right on the precipice of entering the next big demographic. And really what it's kind of raised in my mind is a lot of questions. I started my transition over 20 years ago. And I've been an activist just sometimes out of necessity because, you know, I noticed that there were services and things that our community need that we didn't have. And I think Atlanta is a big city in that we can have nice things in a place like Atlanta. And so, you know, I've tried really hard to help build those things. And, you know, as I move on in my life, you know, new questions are arising. What is my retirement going to look like? Is, you know, how can I successfully age in place is another huge question with all the cost of living, you know, rising here in Atlanta, the cost of housing, and all of that, dealing with sporadic employment over the years, you know, all of those things. So I'm grateful to be here, but I have questions.
Well, and yeah, congrats on almost being in that next demographic. And I'm also kind of hearing that, you know, as you're kind of on that precipice, like here's a whole nother set of questions that are emerging. And yeah, thank you for sharing that. And probably audience, you're hearing a theme already. I mean, obviously it's the people we asked to be here in terms of activism, but, you know, as we're having this discussion, you know, what is demanded of trans and non-binary communities as they're aging in terms of activism. There's activism by choice. There's activism by necessity and survival, right? So thank you, Jamie. Evelyn, you're up.
Oh, how do I feel about aging as a trans person? I often don't feel like I'm ready to even think about aging. I'm still trying to piece together the present in ways that seem to almost make it impossible to think too far into the future, if that makes sense. It's almost, so part of my experience of being trans has been looking anywhere I could to find a social script, much like the ones that cisgender people and other people who are quote unquote normal or the average person get to follow, and really just not being able to find those scripts. So it's almost a strange shift to think about end of life or aging in an organized way when so much of how I've had to approach my own life, my development, my choices has sort of been, you know, left to my own devices, I suppose. So the idea that a life that has started and sort of had to find its way without much planning or outside structure is now prepared to enter into the structure of aging and the structure of planning one's later life. It feels like I'm jumping in halfway through a story, if that makes any sense to you. It's like being invited to help clean up for a party that I was not invited to attend in some ways. So it's a tricky subject to enter into. Contextually, everyone else gave their age, so I suppose I should as well. I turned 35 last month, and I transitioned maybe about 10 years ago. So in some ways, I feel like I'm not even a teenager. So the topic of aging, it's a very hard one to broach with me, I'll admit.
Well, and thank you for leaning into that, Evelyn. I think that congrats on 35. An awesome time of life. Yeah, Jamie knows. We all know who've been there. But yeah, I really appreciate how you put that. It was almost poetic in the best ways and the devastating ways. Like how am I going to think about this? And, you know, wait, 10 years ago, I was in one place. Now I'm in this other place. And so what does that mean? And this party that I haven't been told about yet or invited to? Like, how am I preparing for that? It reminds me of something that Jamie shared, is she's on the precipice. And that phrase you said, Jamie, really stuck out to me: aging in place. I mean, these are things we've heard before, but do we link them to trans and non-binary communities and choices and empowerment? And obviously, you know, Lea is living that at this moment. But in some ways, I want to tell our audience and just acknowledge to all of our presenters that we're all aging all the time. And so there's just the larger thing of ageism and adultism that's going on. We've got ageism, the oppression of older folks, and adultism, the oppression of younger folks. And we just don't seem to be that great about lifespan development as humans. I think some of that might be connected to white supremacy, but we'll come back to that. Well, thank you for those responses. And I know we're going to hear from Masil in a little bit after we move through these questions. But the next question we had generated for this virtual roundtable was kind of based on your lived experiences. You've each done so much advocacy as well, but you have your own lived experiences. What should trans and non-binary people expect from their providers when entering older adulthood? What are the expectations that are there? And we'll see who wants to go first on this one.
It's funny, when I was thinking about this prompt, I feel like I would answer this in a completely different way depending on who I was talking to. Because if I was talking to trans people, then the answer to the question of what should you expect is more cautionary. Whereas if I'm talking to providers, it's more, you know, what should we demand than what should we expect. Really, it's not that much different from, to me anyway, and this could be the naivete of 35, but it's not much different from the things that we should expect and should be able to receive in all healthcare encounters, which is really to be planned for, to be anticipated, and not to arrive as a surprise to the person who we're supposed to trust with our care in the present and in the future.
Wow. Thank you. I'm still processing what you said, but I saw Becca included like just yes, demand. Yeah, thank you for that. What do we need to demand for our community? What do we need to expect?
I have one demand at the very least. You know, if you're a provider, I think basic cultural competency is, I think, part of a baseline. You know, there are trans folks who do this professionally who are happy to, if you haven't had it, trans, gender non-binary 101 kind of cultural awareness. There's plenty of professional trans folks who can speak from their own experience who are happy to do that. And also something I've noticed, like, for example, I was at a school that offered kind of, as part of the academic curriculum, they also offered kind of wellness strategies, shall we say, which included a yoga class. And there came a part of the yoga class where a certain, I think, if I had the term right, asana required, if you were, I guess, assigned male at birth, then you used one hand to do this asana. And if you were assigned female at birth, you used another hand to do this asana. I'm like, y'all, is this really necessary? So, you know, it's little things like that you know, does your program have superfluous, unnecessary gender binaries attached to your service provision? You know, now it is true that, you know, I've been like, one time I had an emergency room experience, and, you know, the nurse was talking to me and was asking me if I was currently pregnant. I said no. And I was, you know, just speaking for myself, you know, I was reluctant to reveal because the medical care I needed had nothing to do with my fertility or anything like that. But I'm not in the business of second questioning doctors a whole lot. So, you know, I roll along with it. But you know, when was my last menstrual cycle? I don't have a menstrual cycle. When did you have a hysterectomy? I was born, I answered, I was born without a uterus. And, you know, it wasn't until one or two questions later that I just kind of disclosed that, you know, I'm trans. And so, and it was for this medical worker, it was such an aha moment. Like I was the first trans person they had ever like even had to think about, much less encounter. So just throwing those out there.
Yeah, I think a lot of times during this webinar where I felt like my jaw was on the ground, but like, it's true. You go into provider offices and from the moment of the intake paperwork, it's male, female, nothing else. And like, why do you even need to know that? Like, what, you know, what are the questions that are really important for provider care? And can we get to a point where providers aren't having their aha moments on the bodies of trans and non-binary folks, but are rather trained? And I think we'll hear that from Dr. Masil George in a little bit. But thank you, Jamie. Lea, I have a feeling you have some stuff to say about this. What can we expect? What should we expect?
Oh, can you hear me?
100%.
Okay. I was born in Chile in 1941. And I discovered that I was trans without any doubt when I was about 10. And then I didn't tell anyone about this until I saw a therapist at 17. And even that therapist told me, well, you are okay, this happens to people, but you better don't tell anyone, okay? This is Chile in 1966 or so. So I didn't tell anyone because he told me, you better don't tell anyone because the people is not ready for people like you. So I kept it to myself and I didn't disclose it except to my psychiatrist. I was in a group after that therapist where everybody disclosed their identities. And that was in Chile. Now, when I came here in 1974, I was 33. And and I went looking for things about trans people in the medical library at Duke. And I discovered a lot, mostly done in Europe and Australia, but almost nothing here. I could read French and Spanish, so that helped me a little bit. But I discovered that there was really a paucity of sources and articles published in this country. So by that time, by 1994, 20 years later than I come here, I discovered that there was a drug called DES, diethylstilbestrol, that was given to women to avoid miscarriage. And from the symptoms that they described in the article, I said, oh, maybe that's what was happened to me, and that's why I'm trans. So the next time that I went to Chile in 1994, I sat my dad, my mother had died when I was 13. I sat my dad and asked him, did my mother take any unusual drugs when she was pregnant with me? I didn't tell him. And he was very uncomfortable and was moving in his seat and said, I had to tell him, this is very important for me, so you need to tell me. And then he told me that my mother had been given in this American clinic that she was doing her prenatal care, a drug to avoid miscarriage. And then I knew. So I decided immediately that I was on a transition and went to several pharmacies around Santiago, Chile, and got hormones, because there they are over the counter. And came back with a big bag of hormones, which I started taking. And I didn't tell my wife, my then wife, until 6 months later. And when I told her, she freaked out. And she said, no, I don't want to be married to a lesbian. And what are people going to think of me, and the whole thing. So the next year in 1995, I had to separate from her in order to transition. And that was the most difficult decision in my life. And later on 95, I went to a endocrinologist and I started my transition officially. And then you have to educate your doctor. Except this doctor who was an endocrinologist and was treating trans people. So I went to her office. I had to wait 4 hours there because she saw me immediately, but she said, we need to run some blood work on you. So they took blood and I had to wait for the results to come back. And only then she saw me like 3 hours later. And then I walked out of the office with a RX for hormones. And she was the only person who knew about this. I then moved to another doctor, and then I had a word by word of mouth. I knew that at Duke there was a doctor seeing trans people, and then I went to Duke, and then I didn't leave Duke because I was an employee at Duke, so I could use my insurance. And even after I left Duke, I have insurance from Duke that covers everything that Medicare doesn't cover. But I have had all kinds of experiences, good and bad, with health providers at Duke. And the most dramatic of them was that I came to a reception and I need to see this doctor, and she looked at the computer and then she leaves me there waiting because I look like a woman, but it said on the screen that I was male and she didn't want to deal with me. So she moved away, and then somebody else came and she said, I'll arrange for you to see this doctor. And I was in tears at the office of the doctor because I had to wait like 15 minutes for somebody to come back and listen to what I had to say. So the doctor immediately called the IT department and told them, I want you to change the gender of this person on their ID. And that was the solution. And I never had any problems. And that's only part of what I have to say, but I'll tell more later.
Okay. Well, thank you, Lea. I mean, I just kind of found my heart kind of caught in my throat as you were telling different parts of your story. Just, you know, the choice between one's identity and one's love. Like, how does anyone make that choice? But somehow we live in a society where people are forced to do that. And then on top of that, okay, educate your doctor. And then the vulnerability, I think, for trans and non-binary folks and for cis folks too. I mean, there's inherent vulnerability. It just the mounting nature of that within trans prejudice and lack of trans knowledge. I mean, it's actually kind of frightening. So thank you for sharing about your journey. This next question, we had a couple of folks who weren't able to be with us tonight, Miss Dee Dee Chambly in Georgia, and Miss Tori Cooper, also formerly of Georgia. But this next question was about intersecting identities. I mean, I think one thing that's really important in TRANSnetwork in Arkansas, North Carolina, and Georgia is we talk about the intersections with racism, with sexism, with obviously aging, but ableism, you know, just there's so many immigrant identity, there's so many different other identities that intersect with gender. And, you know, I'm mindful, like some of them actually don't matter. Like Jamie said, you know, she was at the doctor and it really didn't matter about her gender. It mattered about some other things, but sometimes it does matter. So could you each comment on, you know, just your thoughts about aging as a trans and or non-binary person in terms of having other identities that intersect with that? And it might be privilege or it might be oppression, you know, it could be any one of those. So who would like to go first on this one?
Well, since I've been quiet for a bit, I'll jump in. As a provider and as a researcher, as well as a you know, an Asian woman in Arkansas, I have seen, I guess, both sides of you know, the need to let the information of demographics be accurate on the farm, as well as wondering, well, why are you even collecting this information? So I guess part of it is to try to, you know, mine for data that might be useful in the future, even when we don't know if it is going to be essentially integral for the present. Because sometimes when we do our research and we do our methodology and we plan, we're sometimes surprised to see some information that comes out later in our research that we wished we had collected this information beforehand. So, you know, as much as possible, as long as you're comfortable and feel safe revealing your information about yourself, I encourage you to do so. And if you don't feel safe, it's also very important to state that you don't feel safe or you wish to not disclose that information. I think everybody should, you know, have that opportunity, and I'm hoping that as we, you know, have more options, and I'm seeing that as more of an option, you know, I do not wish to disclose my race, and that's an option. Do not wish to say what age category I'm in, especially if it's not like totally relevant to the research. Or I sometimes actually had a research, you know, request that came up for a geriatrician, and I wasn't comfortable revealing my age. So I wrote in, I do not wish to disclose. So I didn't feel it was relevant, but at least they can, you know, if they were categorizing me, they can put me in a separate category. So we all have information that we are not comfortable situationally disclosing, and it's very important to respect and honor how you feel. as we have more electronic medical records, unfortunately, the only option you had, Lea, at the time was to have someone come and make an adjustment in the records. But now with our electronic medical records, we do have the opportunity to capture that information more accurately.
Evelyn, it looks like you're next, but thank you, Masil. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, really, when I think the most important message for about intersecting identities with trans and non-binary health is that a lot of those intersections probably aren't near where you practice. And by that, I mean that, we've been talking about conversations that you might have with somebody in the room with you. There's a lot of people who don't have the option of being in the room with you. If for it to make sense to have conversations about aging, people have to be in a position to survive readily. And if that's not possible, then we don't even get around to having this conversation. So I guess my message on this would be if trans people in your area are being harassed by strangers, if they're being harassed by the police, attacked for being themselves, that will probably interfere with their ability to plan for later in life. If the trans people in your area are disproportionately affected by unemployment, which is a very frequent thing faced by trans people, they might not even have the insurance or income that would be required to even meet with you in the first place. So if trans people don't have the money to meet with more than one provider, this is something that I see in research, they will often choose to work only with the provider who will also prescribe them their hormones. So if that provider is not also someone who can have these conversations, then again, that's going to be a trans person who's not engaging in these conversations. And from my perspective, really at no fault of their own, there are systemic barriers preventing those conversations from happening. So really it's important to be aware as many things as there are that you can do within your practice, within your work. There are very important things that need to happen outside of your work. Whether that's, be aware of what state and local laws are doing to the trans people in your area. And if they aren't helping, then there are things that we can all do as participants in a democratic society to change those and push for something better. So I guess I just advise no one to take it for granted that every trans person can even make it to the door of your office.
Thanks, Evelyn. And that's why it's so important. And just like you said, I think Jamie was saying, what's the 101, that's not enough, but the basic foundations. That's huge. You're reminding me of a project we both worked on, Project Affirm, where we followed a cohort of 332 trans and non-binary folks. We're still following them in Atlanta, San Francisco, and New York. And, we found what we would expect to find for folks with, BIPOC, trans and non-binary folks, Black, Indigenous, people of color, right? That those intersections of racism, heterosexism, sexism, all the things were just shortening people's lives and what people expected to have as life. So I think what you're saying is a really important reminder. And, I'm also just really being reminded by each of you how important this conversation is to have early on. So trans and non-binary people know how to make those advocacy decisions that Dr. George is talking about. Like, hey, I don't feel safe. Like, don't ask me this. This is my boundary. Did anyone else want to share on this? I have another question we had queued up, but I want to make sure to see if there's anything else you'd like to share here.
Yeah, I'd like to add that, you know, just speaking for myself, you know I've had, um, I've experienced trauma, you know, due to my gender, you know, both mentally and physically. And, you know, several decades of that, I think, um, is, you know, I think there's a cumulative effect to that. And especially when you add on other identities, you know, like being Black and trans in the South, you know, um, I think you have to be conscious of kind of what does that do to one's mental health and over the long term, and what does that do to one's body, and you know what kind of therapies or treatments, you know, would be more appropriate for someone, you know, just because, you know, especially like now, you know, trans people all over the place with these bills, these, you know, another wave of reaction against the fact of young trans people wanting to play sports, you know. We've had years and years of, you know, not being able to turn on the TV or watch a movie without experiencing trans misogyny. I mean, you know, it's in the air. It's in the air we breathe here in this country. And you know, with social media, I think has a way of enhancing that too, you know, and lurching from crisis to crisis, attack to attack. You know, one year it's religious freedom meant to discriminate. This year it's, you know, telling trans kids they can't play sports. All of this, just years and years, you know, being accosted on the street, being abused by family members and loved ones, all of that stuff, it kind of adds up to a pretty, you know, so PTSD, I think, is something that clinically, you know, shows up in folks who experience overlapping oppressions.
Well, thank you, Jamie. That's so important to recognize individual challenges as well as challenges to a community. And I think that can be a big barrier for trans individuals in accessing healthcare. If they've had, you know, almost an anticipatory anxiety that comes on, you know, I have to go see my doctor, but my previous experiences were not pleasant. So important to recognize and to be proactive and first manage the trauma and make sure that that situation does not repeat. As Evelyn mentioned, you know, saying that there's not a script. In a way, we're pioneers, especially individuals like Lea getting into their 80s, 90s, and 100s and beyond. You know, I have a number of patients who are over 100. And you know, when we get there, it's important to make sure that mental health issues are managed and traumas and triggers are managed, and you know, that we recognize, take care of them for ourselves, and make sure that the systems also improve. Thank you.
I have something to say about this, and it's that in my own country, I experienced mostly classism. I was born poor, and I had a good mind, so I was admitted at a very exclusive public high school, and then I was admitted to the university. I was one of the 2% of working class students in the university. And I went there, and I even later was hired by the university to do my work as a student, which is an homage that I have to pay to the to the professors in that university who knew that I was poor and that I have to do a lot of stuff apart from my student work. So jump to this country. I have to come to this country due to a military coup that happened in Chile in 1973. And ironically, I came to the country who had a part in that coup. So the first thing that I discovered was that in this country, I was a person of color because I am Latina. And that was a big surprise to me. Jump a few years forward, and I am buying some clothes at a secondhand store, and the owner looks at me and says, "Oh, you must be having an affair with a seamstress," you know? I didn't say a thing. I just looked at him and ignored him. And then 20 years later, I'm an interpreter. I'm a medical Spanish interpreter at Duke Emergency Room. And there, I have to suffer the looks and gossip between the medical students who are looking at me in my white coat, but I had a ponytail. So they were commenting on me because I was a person of color and I didn't have a clear gender, you know? This is at the emergency room at Duke University, at the hospital. Again, I ignored them, and it took a long time for me to find doctors who knew who I was or didn't care who I was. 5 years ago, I encountered the first new generation doctor who I go to for something with my skin. And then I said to them, wow, I'm surprised that you didn't say anything because I am trans. And then she said, we are all human. And that was a wonderful thing, you know, but it only happened 5 or 6 years ago. And from then on, I have found that most doctors of that cohort or newer are all open because they have had education at their medical school on LGBT health. But that is rather new. And I'm talking about Duke, you know, who has a long exposure to LGBT issues in the university and now at the medical school.
Okay, audience, if you're like me, I'm just making some mental notes of things that need to change in my own healthcare discipline, which is mental health. What are you noticing that needs to change in your discipline? What are the things that you've heard Evelyn and Lea and Jamie share that kind of spur you to take some immediate action, some intentional action, not too quickly, but intentional, so you can start to dismantle cisgender supremacies right where they live in healthcare? What did you hear Dr. George say that might, you know, for our trans and non-binary community members attending today, spur you on to your own boundaries, to ask questions, to demand answers, to kind of get in community and link up and make plans to age in place, et cetera. So I think we're kind of, there are a couple of questions I might come back to for the virtual roundtable, but I also want to shift to Dr. George to just talk about aging in general. And I do see some wonderful questions in the Q&A, so I promise we have an hour and a half webinar, so we have plenty of time to get to those questions. But Dr. George, we wanted to hear from you for about 10 minutes about what are the challenges and opportunities for trans and non-binary older adults that you see as a provider?
Well, thank you. I want to start with some of the comments that we heard from Lea, Jamie, and Evelyn. Lea mentioned the surprise of being 80, and it sounded like a very pleasant surprise. And this is true for a lot of my patients, that they're pleasantly surprised that they're getting to be their age. And they've mentioned that, you know, they don't feel old. Old is always, you know, 10 to 20 years from where I am now. And Evelyn, you might feel that way, you know. You are a teen. Yes, that will. And Jamie mentioned the importance of community. You know, so it's important to make sure that we have a place to discuss our issues with like-minded folks who understand, who have been there, and who can guide us along that process to identify providers who are knowledgeable, who are eager to, you know, provide welcoming and affirming care. Evelyn mentioned that we're not ready, you know, not ready, and the future is somewhat, you know, coming at us fast. But, you know, we have the present moment, and the present is the future in the making. And I firmly believe that the changes we make today are going to ensure a great future. As Lea mentioned, exercising is so important for both physical and mental health. And so it's an exciting time for me as a provider to live through the changes that I have lived through, you know, in my short career. I say short. I started at UAMS in 2007. I still feel young. I feel like a teenager. So, you know, we talk about challenges, I believe, for especially for our trans adults. As people get older, you know, they're afraid of disease. And we think about disease, it could be physical, it could be mental. Trans adults, definitely, it's slightly higher risk of not being diagnosed with diseases early on because of insurance and other reasons. They're not sometimes proactive with their screening healthcare issues. Sometimes, you know, there could be issues with employment as well as insurance. And when they take hormones, you know, if they are, Lea mentioned her own experience of taking hormones that were not particularly prescribed for you. And sometimes, you know, some of the trans adults that I have known have done that too at periodic times when they have not had insurance. They have had ways of getting medications from other countries and not being sure about the doses and so on that they have to take. Sometimes puts them at an increased risk for thrombosis, you know, clots, heart disease. So it's important to be proactive and screen for those conditions. Mental health conditions, you know, very common for trauma, anxiety, to avoid these services, as well as, you know, the services themselves sometimes end up being places where trans older adults can have trauma and stigmatization. So this can sometimes make it difficult for, especially in a university setting when we have providers with high turnover, to have someone consistent that they can go to and feel comfortable going to and telling the story of their life. And sometimes when opportunities change and people have to move to, you know, scale down to a smaller apartment or whatever, you know, they're also thinking about who are my neighbors and feeling safe in that environment. So, you know, talk a little bit about disease in that context, being able to be physically and mentally healthy. And the second thing that older trans adults can face is dependence. And sometimes this can be temporary when someone, for example, has like a hip fracture or some kind of surgery, and they need someone to come and provide services for them in their home, like physical therapy, occupational therapy, and so on, wound care, catheter management. And so this becomes a somewhat of a safety issue because, you know, there could be a number of folks coming in and out of a trans older adult's home. And they do feel vulnerable, and they're sometimes not comfortable displaying photos of their loved ones and so on. And, you know, it's important to feel safe. as dependence grows. And sometimes this dependence can be permanent. You know, sometimes older adults, they develop dementia. They may need somebody else to do their grocery shopping for them, organize medications for them. So it's important that they can have someone that they trust that can do these things for them. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about disability. And of course, nobody wants to talk about death. We're a death-denying, death-defying society. We're going to beat this. But, you know, unfortunately, it is our reality that we have to plan for the possibility that we may need someone else to make choices for us when it comes to healthcare, if we're not able to speak for ourselves. And this could be in a situation where somebody gets to be in a motor vehicular accident, they're fairly healthy, or they have a sudden stroke, or they could have a debilitating illness like a dementia, or even physical problems like COPD, renal failure, that they gradually need more and more help. They become disabled and they have to plan for end-of-life care. So it's important to, as much as possible, try and be proactive in identifying who those people are that you trust to make decisions on your behalf. And this, for our trans older adults, may not necessarily be their next of kin or their blood relatives. It may be somebody that is involved in their care and is engaged with them. It may be a partner, it may be a friend, a neighbor. So it's important to have these conversations before we get to a place where we are scrambling to find who those providers are, when we're not rushed for time and can think through those decisions. So one of the ways to do that is to have an advance directive, which is a document which will list a durable power of attorney for healthcare, which is the who will make the decisions. And the next part is a living will, or what kind of decisions are important. And this typically, would include things like, do you want to be resuscitated? What do you think about artificial nutrition and hydration, and what is important to you at end-of-life care? And another way to also document these in the form of orders for individuals who have life-threatening illnesses and have a prognosis of 1 to 2 years is POLST. So this is a national program where every state in the United States has some form of a POLST form, which is a physician order, which is portable and can be honored across different care settings like nursing home, ER, and physician offices, and so on. So this specifies specific things like what are the resuscitation requirements or preferences, and whether anything in specific is important to this person. For example, someone can say, I do not want blood transfusion, and identify their preferences. And so these are ways to be proactive in dictating things, or documenting things that are important for end-of-life care. So I'm happy to have questions, any specific questions for me. I know there are some questions in the chat, but since I've been talking to you and listening to everybody, I have not looked those up, and they come up. If Anneliese is going to read them for me, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Masil. I know that there was a question about advanced directives from Rose Jade. I think you answered it, but really the need for the up-to-date advanced directives. And so I'm not going to ask people to raise hands or chime in on the chat box, but maybe I will ask folks in the chat box, if you've got an advanced directive that's up to date, let us know. I think even this webinar for me is like an intervention, maybe for our panelists and our attendees. I think we got one question that I want to ask the group that kind of relates to that, which was from some anonymous attendee. Like, it seems like we all spend more years feeling, looking, or thinking like we are old than young. At what age do you feel like you think your chronological age makes you an old person? There's so much ageism and adultism wrapped up in that, right? But I think it goes back to some of the very important issues you're talking about, Dr. George, because sometimes we don't address those issues, especially in trans and non-binary communities, because there's such busy kind of like, hey, we're surviving. Like this takes extra work to address. So panelists, Dr. George, like what age is old? And I realize that there's some embedded ageism in that. So I'm just feeling a certain kind of way about asking it, but I think it's an important one. It's an important question to ask.
Well, I'm going to say, 65 is when you can technically see me because I'm a geriatrician. So I would say that that's a good age. It's you're a young old. So 65 to 75 is a young old person. 75 to 85 is an old person. And 85 and over is the oldest of old. And that actually is the highest growing population in the United States. Not to mention, I'm not particularly sure about the demographics of trans older adults. But, as Lea mentioned, she's surprised that she is where she is and doing what she's doing. So that's a pleasant surprise. And many of my older adults, they're surprised that they say, I know I'm supposed to feel old, but I don't feel old. I feel about 27 or 35, and they're in their 70s and beyond. So I think old is also a feeling. One thing that I also wanted to mention was, also plan to see, get in, contact with the local services that you have, for assisted living and nursing homes. We do have non-discriminatory policies that specifically say that you're not going to be discriminated. But, word of mouth, some places are actually a little bit more affirming, welcoming, especially in community settings, not with COVID, but otherwise, to have activities that are appealing to a wider audience, including our trans adults, than others. And you mentioned that being in Duke is, and being surprised. Being in rural Arkansas, this can be a very scary thing for a lot of our trans older adults, because sometimes they're not comfortable coming out to entire communities. They may, sometimes, and mentioned in our planning sessions, that we find out that after someone has passed, that they did indeed have a different identity that they were truly comfortable with. So to normalize, and for me, one of the ways that we can, and I'm very pleased to see commercials that come out that are more inclusive. We have more race and same gender couples and trans individuals featured, but not so much trans adults, which I would like to see that happen as well. So trans adults can look at someone like them and go, you know what? Yes, this is a place that I would feel comfortable in, and for housing and other places to welcome and advertise this specifically. Thank you.
Jamie, did you have something you wanted to share?
One of my biggest concerns is, I think it's a structural issue in the United States with the nursing home and assisted living situation. First, that there are models that are emerging of since there are concerns and horror stories about the way LGBTQI elders have their experiences in group home, like assisted living places and nursing homes that aren't, that are just, privately operated and with very little analysis or concern about these issues. And so I think there is a movement of folks who are for trying to create a new option for LGBTQI folks who are concerned about that. And in Brooklyn, I think they just opened a senior care facility, a senior housing. And I think that's something to consider, because, one of the things that the pandemic has revealed is that, putting aside the trans and LGBTQ issues, we have a serious problem in this country with the whole approach we have to assisted living and nursing homes. And the pandemic has just tore through it. And especially with southern states, including Georgia, where the industry has contributed heavily to politicians, particularly of one party, that has created a very pro-business climate for these operations here in the state. And the fact that, excuse me, getting a catch in my throat. The fact that the mortality rate is appalling. Over 500,000 Americans dead, and a considerable chunk of those, maybe even a majority, I don't know, nursing homes and assisted living facilities. And so that, just speaking for myself, that gives me serious pause. And so I think, you know, the systemic issue is you have a for-profit system. One answer to that would be a nonprofit system. And so, you know, that would be organized by members of the community to care for other members of the community, because the situation we have now is unacceptable. It's just unacceptable. And, you know, especially for trans folks who lose contact, lose that family support, you know, who, the question is, who is going to take care of me? You know, I'm, you know, personally, I'm an only child of my parents, and, you know, I already helped my mom a lot, especially through this pandemic. Who's going to take care of me? Can I count on having a partner who's healthy, you know, if I make it to 80? And so these are the questions and concerns. But, you know, especially the pandemic, I think, has revealed that we have serious systemic issues that are both bigger than our, you know, relatively small community, but that our community is disproportionately affected by. We don't even know, you know, we know that Black Americans have perished in way disproportionate numbers from this, and it's connected to poverty and systemic violence. And we know already that with just everyday things like housing and employment, that LGBT, especially trans and gender non-binary, experience oppression in disproportionate amounts in these regards. And so we've only begun to sift through the wreckage that just has been wrought in the last year, and to figure out how much of a crisis are we in as a community with the kind of the lack of aging services in our community. That's what's on my mind.
Oh, well, those are truth bombs you just dropped. And, you know, in some ways it goes back to, I think what you all are sharing reminds me of why we did make sure that Evelyn and Jamie were on this panel. I think as we were planning that, you know, there's the planning ahead for community of yeah, not to fix broken systems, but demand more from systems, to be more connected. I think about some of Sel Wang's early research with Black trans women who, you know, there was this idea of thick trust that exists with, you know, trans and non-binary communities of color, where many people can be like called in at a very quick notice to help. Well, the earlier we start having these conversations, the stronger these networks can be. and you're hearing my partner feed our cat right now, so sorry about that. We're Zooming from home, right? But I think that it also makes me think about, I just moved from Atlanta to New Orleans, and there's a group here of Black and brown trans women leaders who they were like done with like the city of New Orleans trying to make things better. And they just raised a whole ton of money and bought a house, and they're like housing themselves. They're creating. And so, I mean, we see these kind of trans neighborhoods and districts, you know, popping up around the country. So I think there's so much truth in what you said, Jamie. I do know we have a couple of questions. It's House of Tulip. Yes, Ames. Mariah Moore, like Milan Sherry and Dylan Wagaspak and so many other folks. But in terms of, you know, this is maybe a question for Dr. George, but also for all the panelists. Catrice Baker is asking about complications like COVID vaccine, hormones, aging. Are there things that our trans elders should be aware of right now?
It's a great question. You know, then that means that it's something that I have to check on. Quite honestly, I'm not sure about the answer to that. But if you were to ask me, you know, I would definitely look up that before giving you the answer. And I mean, if you were about to get the vaccine, I would say, let's go ahead and get it. I don't know of specific contraindications or caution, but I'd be curious to find out, and I definitely would do that. Thank you.
I'm glad to hear that, because I'm scheduled for one soon, and don't know the complications. But I think that's an important point to get across. As much uncertainty as there is in anything, especially in these times, being trans and entering into already uncertain medical situations is just an additional level of uncertainty. So for all of the questions a cisgender patient might have about the COVID vaccine, there are more, and a lower chance that any of them have definitive answers in research or practice.
Yes, that's right, Evelyn. You know, I've had a number of patients who are immune compromised, who have various pre-existing conditions that have concerns for whether they should take these vaccines. And when I have a question, you know, I talk to their rheumatologist or nephrologist or specialist, and most times it has been to go ahead and get the vaccine. So thank you.
Yeah, and so, I mean, I love this conversation because it ties so tightly in between research and healthcare. Lea.
I want to say that I think the basic problem here, and we haven't spoken about this, is white supremacy, because that is at the top of everything that is happening in this country. And we should address that, even if one round, to clarify all the implications of white supremacy has in all the systems in place. So, number one, I have to say that as a person of color in this country, or as just a person in this country, I have a profound lack of confidence in every system that exists, because they're all brought up by the white supremacy. And even those that say that we are anti-racist, you know, they are doing that because they want to defend their privileges. I belong to a sort of religious church. Well, it's called a fellowship that has initiated dialogues which are different for the white person than the person of color, okay? And that is apparently a good intention way of the whites recognizing their own privileges and the person of color finding their lacks, you know. But I find that even in this system, there is a white streak in all of it, which negates the declared object of this initiative. And I'm very confused, because I thought this was a good intention, and I see that it's just hiding the fear from the whites of losing control. And that is extensible to every system in existence in this country. So I just want to hear what people have to say about this, because if we don't realize this, we cannot build better systems, okay? And I think we deserve better systems.
Well, Lea, thank you for your comment. You know, I grew up in India. I've worked in England, and I worked in the Caribbean island of Trinidad and Tobago. And my own personal experience has been that America has been really welcoming to me. As a female immigrant, I have felt like I have had a better opportunity to use my voice than, you know, even compared to India, in various areas, like my interest in ethics and my interest in LGBTQ advocacy. I'm surprised, pleasantly surprised, to have the opportunity to be involved in the level that I have been able to. And from my personal experience, I can say that, you know, that would not have been my experience back in India or the UK or Trinidad, because, you know, in India, I would have definitely felt as a woman, and therefore not a strong voice. And in the other countries, I felt more like an immigrant, and I feel more welcomed here. But, you know, all of us have our own experiences, which are unique, and they all have to be honored and appreciated and uplifted to the extent possible.
And I think when I hear Lea speak, I'm just thinking about, you know, the impact of colonization over time, you know, mostly white Euro colonization. You know, what happened to the Hijras of South Asia, you know, post-British colonization, trans people who were held in very different regard and with different resources. So I hear you, Masil. It's like the patriarchy of different cultures is so brutal. But you know, if we think about the roots of healthcare, I mean, the things we're having, well, we have the opportunity to look at, especially since, you know, the murder of Black man George Floyd by a white police officer, David Chauvin. We just know that, you know, medical care in the US has a pretty sick history. Like the patient, and I think when I hear Lea talk, I'm really thinking about, like, in many ways, the patient is white supremacy, but the symptoms of that are, you know, trans death, Black death. And if we're going for more than individual good experiences, we're going for life. And so that means reclaiming so much. And I think medical schools, mental health programs, hopefully, are starting to look at our roots. You know, in my profession of psychology, I was taught this lie that William James started psychology, this random white guy. And it's like, he just coined a word, but the practice of psychology has to have its roots in the continent of Africa, because that's where all humans came from. And we know where the gender variance and awesomeness was happening, but, you know, we've lost much of that due to colonization. I do think there are a couple other questions I want to make sure we get to, but that was a really deep one. How can we uplift our TGNC family in rural settings where healthcare access is limited? And I'll share for the person who asked that, for DJ Alexander, you know, when we were planning this webinar, we were like rural aging. So that's probably one that's coming pretty quickly. But we felt like aging was huge. So thank you for asking that intersectional question. What do we do? I know in Georgia, it's been tough. Like in some ways, people have, fictive kin networks and, small networks that can help. But I'm thinking about Jamie's comments about who will care for me. What are your thoughts about how we can do better in these areas, Evelyn?
Oh, I think if you're in the situation where you're the primary provider to a TGNC person in a rural setting where you're fairly confident that there's not really a lot of other support, I think the two best things you can do is first, do everything you can to be the most accepting part of their day, week, month, and year. Because if you can do that, and in some places that's a really low bar to beat, but if you can do that, you're going to have an excellent relationship that will probably survive even slip-ups or the things that you have to do as you learn, because everything is relative. And I can't tell you the number of things I look back on and say, like, if I had experienced that today, I would have been mad. But where I was 10 years ago, that was a breath of fresh air. So if you can be that breath of fresh air, then you will be doing a lot to help that individual. And outside of that, I would say be fluent, reasonably fluent in resources that connect that person outside of that rural area. I think that's really the magical thing about the internet, is that we're no longer bound geographically to communities that are both accessible and nearby. Now, access is not mediated by location. So being familiar enough with those resources to direct someone towards support that may not be present in the immediate area.
Thank you. Lea, did you have something?
Well, I totally coincide with Evelyn's points. And I want to highlight what she says about being the person that made that person stay, because we all need that to begin with. And if we can be that person, it's our almost our obligation to offer that breath of fresh air. And one thing I can add is that to measure, the best way to approach the issue of white supremacy is to initiate independent action. Like you said, there is in Tulane or in Louisiana, where you are now. There's no better example than to do what you want to do.
Thank you, Lea. Jamie, you've lived in many of these rural areas, born and raised, return there often. I'm curious if you want to chime in here, and Dr. George as well.
Yeah, and to address the issue of white supremacy, certainly as a white trans person, I have a responsibility to call that out and recognize it. And also, and knowing that I have the choice, in what kind of activism that I do choose to do my organizing within a framework of organizations that are led by Black trans activists, and to support the work that they're doing. As far as the rural aspects, living in Macon, Georgia, the problem is in, Georgia's a state that hasn't opted into Medicaid expansion. And so a lot of rural hospitals are going under. And so even, the notion of a rural provider is kind of relative, because, you know, if you're providing services, chances are you're doing it from a hospital or a medical facility in the county seat of probably the largest populated town, you know, within 20 to 50 miles. And I think also, you know, you can be, you know, for folks who are kind of within resourced organizations or who are adjacent to resources and philanthropy, I highly encourage you to, you know, if you know of a local trans support group who, you know, who needs help, who needs somewhere to meet, and could probably do great work if they had resources. You could be being adjacent to all these positions of power. You can leverage your own privilege to bring resources to these communities yourself. They're, you know, philanthropic organizations are increasingly looking to us south. You know, we had this electoral victory that was here in Georgia recently that was, you know, years and years in the making by grassroots organizations just starting up, sometimes, you know, doing this organizing in South Georgia, in North Georgia, in rural areas. And so look for those opportunities and to help where you are.
Well, I am just seeing the love in the chat box for each of you. And, you know, as we start to wrap up in the next couple of minutes, any final words? I feel like Lea gets the last word on this since she was up first. But Evelyn, any last words for our audience? And then we'll go to Jamie and Dr. George, then Lea.
I mean, building off the idea of leveraging your own privilege, I'm grateful to each and every one of you who are here, because the fact that you are here shows that you are probably less of the overarching problem than, say, some of your colleagues who aren't here. So I would encourage you to do what you can to bring other people into this conversation, people who might not be drawn to it or might not know that this conversation is going on, because it's a system. The system needs to change, and even as individuals like you work to change yourselves, there's so much of a big lift ahead of us, and everything, all hands on deck, really. So thank you for coming.
Jamie.
Yeah, I always learn so much from myself in these kind of web scenarios, and so I just appreciate being a part and being able to share my experience for better or worse, and I really appreciate everyone here on the panel as well, and your points of view are important and valid and should be uplifted.
Thank you, Jamie. Dr. George.
Well, I want to echo what Evelyn said. You know, one thing about the pandemic is that it has definitely helped us to reach out to our people in the rural communities. And as we want to encourage more adults, older adults, to age in place, you know, we can think about those as continuing channels of education. And, you know, I'm continuing to do what I can do, both at the university level and at the student education level, as a family practitioner out in various areas. So, you know, it's helpful to use, again, all hands on deck and do all the best that we can do all of the time.
I'm just gonna finish by saying word from one of the Roosevelts. I don't know if it was FDR or T. He said, one of them said, do what you can with what you have where you are.
Ooh, Audience, yeah, thank you, Leah. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you, Dr. George. If you could just drop one word in the chat box so we could really just appreciate our panelists and just thank each of you for attending. I heard so much that I'm going to go back into my own practice and learn. I personally, came into my own sexuality and gender because of Black and brown trans women in New Orleans. So being back in this city just makes me be grateful for life. And so what I want to remind our trans and non-binary community is that when you live, others live. There's so many gems you dropped. Be a breath of fresh air. Connect people to resource, leverage your own privilege. There's one elder who shared, we're fighting for our lives. If things are all right for trans people in the US, then everyone else will be fine in America. I think there's probably something pretty true about that. So panelists, I hope you're receiving the love that's coming in the chat box. Please, once this comes out, we have a Facebook group. Hey, Michiko, oh my gosh, all the way from Japan. That's awesome. We're going to share this out on our Facebook group, TRANSnetwork. If you want to be a part of that, please reach out to us and get added. I want to thank our team again, Becca Ingram Estevez, Antonia Petit in North Carolina, Kate Stewart, Alex and Melissa in Arkansas. And yeah, we can't wait to share this out. And thank you all, everyone. I hope you share this recording with people who really need it for learning and growth and accountability. Have a wonderful evening. Take good care. Stay safe during the pandemic. And I can't wait to hug and squeeze on folks once we're out of this. Good night, everyone.